Good afternoon. Today I will talk about week 5, and we're actually reviewing chapter 6, which is talking about a lot of different types of learning. So I will give you a brief overview of those 3 main types of learning and some examples too that hopefully will help you understand each one of those concepts. So the first thing that we want to remember is that there are 3 major principles or forms of learning. One is classical conditioning, and what we look at with classical conditioning is learning to associate 2 different events. Operant conditioning is when we learn to continue behaviors because they are rewarded, or we discontinue behaviors because we're punished. And then the third is observational learning, and that's just exactly what the term says. It means that we learn by observing or imitating other individuals. So an important factor to remember as far as learning is that we have a tendency to associate events that occur in a sequence. And so first let's talk about classical conditioning. And usually if students have difficulty with the different learning models, this is the hardest one to remember because of all the different terms that are associated with this model of learning. Most of you are probably familiar with Pavlov's dogs. He is the individual who first explored classical conditioning. And one way that virtually all organisms learn to adapt to their environment is through classical conditioning. And so we look at some of these different terms. The stimulus is an event that causes something else, a response, to happen. The unconditioned, if we see unconditioned, that means unlearned, and then the opposite of that would be conditioned, which means learned. So when we're talking about classical conditioning, we're really talking about classical learning. So we start with an unconditioned response, and that is usually a reaction to something that naturally or automatically triggers an unlearned response. Then we have to have a conditioned stimulus is usually neutral, but through learning and that process of learning, we will associate that with an unlearned response. And a conditioned response is a learned response to what was once a neutral stimulus, but now becomes a conditioned stimulus because of all the practice. Now, some of you are probably sitting there shaking your head saying, I have no clue what you just said. So let me go ahead and use an example to hopefully clarify these terms for you. An example is perhaps as a child, you were playing in the yard one day, minding your own business, and mom or a neighbor's cat wanders over into your yard. Your mom, who, let's pretend she's afraid of all sorts of animals, screamed, picked you up, and ran into the house. Now, her behavior caused you to cry because you were scared, you didn't know what was going on, and now you have developed a fear of cats. When we look at phobias, this is usually one of the ways that a phobia could be created is through classical conditioning. So let's pull that apart and look and see what the different terms are in response to that example. The once neutral stimulus that becomes the conditioned stimulus is the cat. So before mom picked you up and ran into the house screaming, it was a neutral stimulus. However, seeing it causes a response, so now it becomes a conditioned stimulus. So something's going to happen every time you see a cat. The unconditioned stimulus would be how your mom reacted. She started screaming. Now, the conditioned response, or the learning that occurred, is how you react today. You're still afraid of cats because it was a learned behavior. And then finally, the unconditioned response, or not learned response of crying, is something that's going to happen to you naturally because you see a cat. Now, operant conditioning, I think, is a little easier to explain, and I'm not sure if any of you have had the opportunity to be a visitor in Black Hills in South Dakota, but they have a perfect example of operant conditioning there in one of their sideshows, I call it. But B.F. Skinner is the individual that we usually associate with operant conditioning. And he says that if you have a certain behavior and it's rewarded, then it's more likely it's going to occur, which makes sense. In operant conditioning, the individuals associate their own actions with consequences. So we know that if an action is followed by a reinforcer or something positive, that action is going to increase, or we're going to see it happen again. While if the actions are followed by a punisher or some sort of a negative consequence, then we know that that behavior is probably going to decrease. So I talked a little, or referenced the Black Hills in South Dakota, and they have an area where they have chickens lined up in these glass boxes. And if the chicken hits a certain button, they shoot a basket, which I know sounds crazy. I don't know if it's done by air or what, but they shoot a basket and they get a piece of corn. So every time they hit this button that shoots the basket, they get rewarded by a piece of corn. So we know that with operant conditioning, if they're being reinforced, which they are, they get a piece of corn each time they do this, this is something that they're going to continue to do. Now, if there was a shock that they received every time they pushed this button, it would probably extinguish that behavior. They would stop doing that. They don't want to be shocked. They'd wonder where the corn is. So let's think of another example. Let's say that you're a supervisor in a manufacturing plant locally, and you want to use positive reinforcement to increase the productivity of your workers. So what would you do? So take a few seconds and think about that. How could you increase their productivity if you use a positive reinforcement? Well, there are a lot of different avenues that you could travel. However, basically what you're going to need to make sure is that your employees are given some sort of an immediate bonus or reinforcement for a specific behavior that's related to their productivity. Now they have to know what is it that you expect of them and what will they receive if they meet this goal. And really, you will be able to increase productivity. As a teacher, if you are in a classroom setting, a face-to-face setting, if you are complimenting and thanking and encouraging that contact or that discussion within the classroom, pretty soon you're going to see that more students are willing to participate in that discussion because they've been positively reinforced or they've seen other individuals be positively reinforced. And that's where the third learning style comes in, and that's modeling or learning by observation. So learning by observation or imitating another person's behavior is called modeling or observational learning. Albert Bandura is the one that is best known for the research in this type of learning. Models are very effective. If an individual believes that the model, the person they're watching, is similar to themselves, they're successful or admirable, it's more likely that they're going to follow in the footsteps and model or imitate that individual. That's why superstars, basketball players, football players, that type of thing, why they have so much power even if they don't want it. If an individual, a child, a teenager, an adult identifies with them, believes that they're successful or that they're similar, they're probably going to try and imitate those behaviors. So we want our superstars or sports stars to be a positive role model because the children and the adolescents are going to model what they see if they like that person. So here's a really good example. When I was growing up, it was not legal or it was not illegal, to not buckle up. Thank goodness, over the years, that's become a law. But if we want to look at observational learning, let's use the example of a mom that tells her children all of the time, it's so important, you must buckle up, safety first, it's a law, please get in, the first thing you need to do when you get into the car is to buckle up. So if the parent or the mom gets into the car, remember, buckle up, and is very positive, but chooses not to buckle up herself or is pretty inconsistent, what can we theorize or guess that's going to happen with these children? Well, the answer is that they're probably going to tell other people, hey, it's really important to buckle your seatbelt and you need to make sure and be safe, and it's a law, and so we really need to make sure this is done. However, they're not going to use their seatbelt very often. And so that really proves that actions do speak louder than words.